Happy Halloween week, everybody. I am reading a book called The Dead Won't Hurt You, and it comes from the red section of the library, the horror section. And this one's from a book called Invasion of the Road Weenies. If you like scary short stories that are just kind of quirky and fun to read out loud, check these books out. There's different volumes of them. The gate to the cemetery wasn't locked. That had been Eric's last hope. He'd been prepared to shake the bars, then turn to his friends and say, "I guess we can't do it." The gate swung when he pushed, moving without the slightest creak. To Eric, the unexpected silence was worse than any graveyard moan of rusted metal. He felt as if he was watching a movie with the sound turned off. For an instant, he thought of an old, scratchy, silent film, that first vampire movie with the freaky-looking bald guy. "I'm out of here," Bennett said. Eric made no comment as Bennett raced away. He watched Jacob and Lance, wondering if they'd chicken out. They both looked at him, obviously wondering the same thing. Last chance, Eric thought. All three of them could quit right now, and there'd be no blame to anywhere. But the moment came and passed. Eric drew a deep breath of the damp air and stepped through the gate of the cemetery. He checked his watch, just 10 minutes to go, then he could leave. He couldn't even remember which of them had suggested they visit a cemetery at midnight. But once the idea had been spoken, they'd teased and taunted each other until they had to do it. Eric couldn't admit that the cemetery terrified him. Even in daylight, even as far as possible from midnight, he avoided this field of headstones and monuments. Eric thought about last year when they'd buried Hunter Reynolds. Eric had pretended to be sick so he wouldn't have to go to the funeral. In the cemetery, he hadn't even really known Hunter. They weren't in any of the same classes at school. They'd been on that Little League team together 3 years back, the one that had almost made it to the state playoffs. Eric always kept as much distance as he could between himself and the dead. Until now. They walked toward the center of the cemetery, the spot they'd agreed upon for their midnight adventure. Jacob was the next to turn and run. "I can't," he said. And when they were halfway there, "Sorry." "Looks like it's just you and me," Lance said. "Yeah," Eric squeezed out that single word, not trusting his voice to speak a full sentence without trembling. Not much farther, he told himself. It wasn't that far to midnight, and it wasn't that far to the center of the cemetery. Lance stopped walking. "You hear that?" "No," Eric looked around. "What?" "I heard something. Footsteps." "Cut it out." Eric listened to the dead silence around him. "Man, you don't hear it?" Lance asked. Eric shook his head. "Forget this," Lance said. He spun away from Eric and sprinted back toward the gate. Eric knew he was free to follow his friends. Just being the last to leave, that was a victory. But he was so close. He checked his watch. Only 5 more minutes. He continued walking toward the center of the cemetery, his breath growing shallow, his ears straining for any hint of the sounds that had spooked Lance. He heard nothing. Any other place on earth, the peacefulness would have been pleasant. Here, the silence was a reminder of what lay beneath the ground. Eric reached the center of the cemetery, then checked his watch. 3 minutes. He knew he could make it. Just this once, he told himself. All he had to do was stay in place and fight the terror for a little while, and he'd be able to do anything, face any fear at all. He looked at the rows of headstones, wondering where Hunter was buried. "People don't understand." The voice from behind cut into his thoughts like a hatchet. Eric spun around and shouted in surprise. "Hey, relax," the man said. "You scared me," Eric said. "I didn't hear you walk up." He was surprised a guy that big could move so quietly. The man laughed and scraped a foot against the ground. "I'm not a ghost," he said. He slapped his chest. "See? Real and solid." "Yeah," Eric waited for his nerves to stop buzzing. The man put a hand on Eric's shoulder. "People don't understand," he said. "There's nothing scary here. The dead won't hurt you." "Guess not," Eric said. He wanted to pull away. "No," the man said, "the dead won't hurt anyone, and they keep their secrets." Eric tried to step back. The fingers tightened on his shoulder. "It's the living," the man said. "The people who haunt the places where nobody goes. That's who you have to watch out for. It's the people in the alleys, the people in the cemetery at night, the people who hope to catch you alone." "What?" Eric pulled harder against the man's grip, trying to get free without turning his attempt into a struggle. He didn't understand what this man was talking about, but deep inside, he was afraid he knew exactly what the man meant. The bell in the town clock began to strike the hour. The man laughed. He reached toward Eric with his other hand. "Let me go!" Eric shouted. He twisted his body, breaking loose. The instant he slipped from the man's grasp, Eric rushed blindly away. The man swore and chased after him. Eric could hear the footsteps close behind him. He knew that any second he'd be tackled or grabbed and swept off his feet. Then he'd be found dead like Hunter Reynolds, and the adults would talk about it in whispers. Eric shouted again, but the bell drowned out his voice. He ran across a stretch of manicured lawn, dodging left and right between headstones, knowing his feet were landing on graves, knowing he stepped on the dead as he raced for his own life. "Run, boy, run!" the man behind him yelled. "Makes it more fun." The sound of the bell wrapped around Eric like deep water. He gasped, trying to find more speed. As the 12th peal rode on a wave through the air, Eric heard a scream, short, cut off, a howl of frustration and surprise, followed by another sound that he'd never forget. The wet thud of a thick fruit smashed against a sidewalk. Eric dared a glance over his shoulder. He stopped in his tracks. In his field of death, the living man who'd pursued him had suddenly and undeniably joined the dead. Trembling, Eric crept back even as his mind screamed for him to keep running. The man had tripped and fallen, hitting his head on a gravestone. Eric didn't want to look, but he had to. Death was still and quiet and final. The man's legs rested above a grave. The earth was undisturbed except for a spot next to the man's right foot. Here, the earth was pushed up, the grass torn, as if a hand had risen to clutch at the passing ankle. Eric knelt and gently touched the stone. "Thanks," he whispered. He didn't need to read the inscription. He knew who was buried there. "Thanks, Hunter. Sorry I didn't come before." There was no answer. He expected none. Eric stood and walked slowly toward the cemetery gate. He had no urge to rush. He had no fear. He knew the dead would never hurt him. Okay, this next story comes from a really popular book in the library, and they've made at least one movie out of it, Scary Stories to Tell in the Dark by Alvin Schwartz. So this story is called The Wendigo. A wealthy man wanted to go hunting in a part of northern Canada where few people had ever hunted. He traveled to a trading post and tried to find a guide to take him, but no one would do it. It was too dangerous, they said. Finally, he found a Native American who needed money badly, and he agreed to take him. The Native American's name was DeFago. They made camp in the snow near a large frozen lake. For 3 days they hunted, but they had nothing to show for it. The third night, a windstorm came up. They lay in their tent, listening to the wind howling and the trees whipping back and forth. To see the storm better, the hunter opened the tent flap. What he saw startled him. There wasn't a breath of air stirring, and the trees were standing perfectly still. Yet he could hear the wind howling, and the more he listened, the more it sounded as if it were calling DeFago's name. "DeFago," it called. "DeFago." I must be losing my mind, the hunter thought. But DeFago had gotten out of his sleeping bag. He was huddled in a corner of the tent, his head buried in his arms. "What's this all about?" the hunter asked. "It's nothing," DeFago said. But the wind continued to call to him, and DeFago became more tense and more restless. "DeFago," it called. "DeFago." Suddenly, he jumped to his feet and he began to run from the tent, but the hunter grabbed him and wrestled him to the ground. "You can't leave me out here," the hunter shouted. Then the wind called again, and DeFago broke loose and ran into the darkness. The hunter could hear him screaming as he went. Again and again he cried, "Oh, my fiery feet, my burning feet of fire!" Then his voice faded away and the wind died down. At daybreak, the hunter followed DeFago's tracks in the snow. They went through the woods, down toward the lake, then out onto the ice. But soon he noticed something strange. The steps DeFago had taken got longer and longer. They were so long, no human being could have made them. It was as if something had helped him to hurry away. The hunter followed the tracks out to the middle of the lake, but there they disappeared. At first he thought that Defago had fallen through the ice, but there wasn't any hole. Then he thought that something had pulled him off the ice into the sky, but that made no sense. As he stood wondering what had happened, the wind picked up again. Soon it was howling as it had the night before. And then he heard Defago's voice. It was coming from up above, and again he heard Defago screaming, "My fiery feet, my burning feet!" But there was nothing to be seen. Now the hunter wanted to leave that place as fast as he could. He went back to camp and packed. Then he left some food for Defago and he started out. Weeks later, he reached civilization. The following year, he went back to hunt in that area again. He went to the same trading post to look for a guide. The people there could not explain what had happened to Defago that night, but they had not seen him since then. "Maybe it was the Wendigo," one of them said, and he laughed. "It's supposed to come with the wind. It drags you along at great speed until your feet are burned away, and more of you than that. Then it carries you into the sky, and it drops you." It's just a crazy story, but that's what some of the Native Americans say. A few days later, the hunter was at the trading post again. Another Native American came in and sat by the fire. He had a blanket wrapped around him, and he wore his hat so you couldn't see his face. The hunter thought there was something familiar about him. He walked over and asked, "Are you Defago?" The Indian didn't answer. "Do you know anything about him?" No answer. He began to wonder if something was wrong, if the man needed help, but he couldn't see his face. "Hey, are you all right?" he asked. No answer. To get a look at him, he lifted the Native American's hat. That's when he screamed. There was nothing under the hat but a pile of ashes. The Wendigo. Here's another story from Invasion of the Road Weenies. This is called the La Brea Toy Pits. Have you ever heard of the La Brea Tar Pits? Well, this is called the La Brea Toy Pits. "We've arrived," Lyle's father announced, waking Lyle from his nap. "We're here, we're here, we're here," Lyle's little brother Scout shouted. "Yay! Chill out, Scout," Lyle said as he sat up and stretched. "It's just a bunch of pits full of gooky stuff." He didn't know why his folks had dragged them there. He had seen the place on TV and there was nothing exciting about it. So what if some dinosaurs had been stupid enough to get stuck in the tar a million of years ago? "Are you sure this is it?" Lyle's mom asked. She pointed out the window. "That seems like a small sign for such a famous place." Lyle looked. The sign didn't offer much information except that this was the way to the pits. There was an arrow at the bottom aimed at a path that curved out of sight and to the left. "Certainly," Lyle's dad said. He patted the map that was lying on the dashboard. "I always know where I'm going." "It looks a lot smaller than I expected," Lyle's mom said, "and there aren't any other cars." "Stop worrying," his dad said. "This is the right place. We just got here ahead of the rush." "If you say so." "Come on, kids," Lyle's mother said. "Let's go." Lyle grabbed his yo-yo and followed his family through the empty parking lot. "I need a new string," he called to his mom. "Lyle, stop fooling around with that thing and pay attention," his mom said. "We didn't drive all the way here so you could play." "That's for sure," Lyle muttered. He checked out his yo-yo string. It was worn pretty badly in a couple of spots, but with luck, it would last a few more days. He wound it up and did it around the world. Ploink. Lyle reached out as the string broke and his yo-yo went flying through the air. It bounced to a landing and clattered across the solid tar of the parking lot, wobbling like a small animal that had just run headfirst into a large tree. "My yo-yo!" he said, chasing off after it. The yo-yo rolled down a hill at the edge of the parking lot. Lyle glanced at his parents. "I'll be right there," he called. "Don't get lost," his mom called back. "We'll meet you in the tar pits." She and the others headed for the path that led from the parking lot through a field. Lyle chugged down the hill. When he reached the bottom, he stared at the strange landscape. It took him a moment to realize what he was looking at. The first toy that caught his eye barely looked like a toy. He stared at the strangely familiar object for long seconds before the shape made sense to his mind. "A tricycle," he said. Half sunk in the ground, the discarded vehicle was mostly dull brown and black from rust and weather. It took Lyle another second to realize that the whole area in front of him was filled with toys. Heaps and piles of toys. Most of them were in far better shape than the tricycle, and far more interesting. Many even looked brand new. "Wow," Lyle whispered, forgetting about his yo-yo. Stretching before him was every toy he'd ever dreamed of, and many he never knew existed. Lyle stepped on the seat of the tricycle. It wobbled a little, but it didn't tip. Right past the handlebars, Lyle saw a model of the SR-71 Blackhawk. He reached down and pulled it free from the muck. "Cool," he said. He took another step, planting his foot on an official NBA basketball that was 3/4 submerged in the muck. Just ahead, he saw a radio-controlled car, the kind with the really large tires and directional steering. "Awesome," Lyle said. He dropped the plane and picked up the car. The controller was only a few feet away, wedged between a red radio flyer wagon and a pogo stick. Lyle stepped on a Cabbage Patch doll and grinned as he felt the head sink down. Lyle's grin faded as his foot kept sinking. "Hey," he staggered, setting his other foot down hard against the top of a chutes and ladders board. The board tilted and sunk into the tar. Small bubbles rose to the goopy surface and burst. Lyle's foot sank in right after the board. "Oh man," Lyle said. He tried to pull his foot out. No use. "Help!" Lyle cried. "I'm stuck!" There was no answer. "Help!" Lyle cried again as loudly as he could. "Lyle!" his mom called from far off. "Over here!" Lyle shouted. He felt himself sinking deeper. "Hurry, I'm stuck!" "Good grief, Lyle," his dad called from behind him. "How did you get yourself in such a mess?" Lyle heard his dad scrambling over the toys. Then he felt a strong pair of hands grab his sides and pull. His dad lifted him from the tar. "Look at your pants, young man," his mom said when Lyle had been deposited on solid turf. "Maybe this will teach you not to run off." "Oh, I think he's learned his lesson," Lyle's dad said. "Haven't you, son?" "Yeah," Lyle said, "I sure have." His dad grinned and ruffled Lyle's hair. "How about we go see those tar pits, okay, son?" "Sure, Dad," Lyle said. "That sounds great." He followed his parents away from the toys. "I think we can cut through here," his dad said, angling at the left at the bottom of the hill. They walked a short distance through thick woods. Lyle's mom saw it first. "Oh, my word. Look at that dining room set," she said. She was carrying Scout as she dashed ahead of the others. Lyle's father gasped. "A metric socket wrench. Isn't that a beauty?" He rushed forward. "Toasters," his mom said. "All those toasters. My word. There's a 4-slice model." Lyle chased after his parents, but they were already deep into the pile of Thigh Masters, DVD players, Civil War chess sets, and power tools. "Stop!" Lyle shouted, stepping on top of an outdoor gas grill. The grill shifted and sank deeper into the tar. "Look, hun," Lyle's dad called to Lyle's mom, holding up a chrome shower head. "Wouldn't this be great in the bathroom? It has 5 different spray settings, plus a water saver option and a heavy-duty pulsing mode." "Dishes!" his mom exclaimed, bending down to stroke the fine china at her feet. "What a lovely pattern." She sank lower, taking Scout with her. Lyle leaped from the grill, aiming for the top of a surround sound stereo speaker. He missed and came down into a puddle of muck between a garage door opener and a weed whacker. "Mom!" he shouted. "Dad!" They didn't seem to hear him. Lyle sighed. Lyle sank. He looked at his parents. They were sinking too, but they didn't appear to mind. Scout minded, but as usual, nobody was paying attention to him. Lyle sank to his chest and then to his chin. As the tar reached his ears, he heard his last words. It was his mom speaking. "A pasta maker," she said. "I'd give anything for one of those."